the hollow out to waiting for the later piece to create double interlocking. And this video shows the starting of the assembling operation. And also from the section here, you can see Baroque also likes to focus on empty space, and which means the inner space of the sculpture. So for those pieces, not for assembling purpose, we could still see some hollows or voids within the pieces. And for the 3D puzzle, the idea is to redeploy the form of torero as a human body and keep the key operation of the assembly. So in this video, you can see this assembling video, you can see that the massing is separated into two parts, and each represents the original downward body and upper body, and a gap is left between. So this approach partially exposed the section and mechanism for the puzzle, increasing the complexity of the aesthetics and creating a focus for composition. And also for the materiality, the transparent material is for the key elements, so which would be the chest and the back, and there would be almost like a two gap in the model, like a physical one separating two masses, and also like a virtual one partially revealing the mechanism. And the metallic material becomes a tool to highlight the operation. And also for the assembly, the original operation is preserved, especially the key elements, and also the carve-out aesthetics from the interior space of torero creates a cohesive language for each parts. So here are the key elements. The first one would be the operation of the key and keyhole, and also becomes like a shared elements in the following steps. And the second one is the unique sequence created by the insertion of different direction. And the third one is a two-step insertion from the last two pieces to create double interlocking. So because of the redeployment of the original body parts, the pivot operation is also included to fix parts from different direction. And also the imperfection of the sphere also imply the misreading for the insertion and is further applied to different parts, such as a fake mark or like a pivot. And for the 2D puzzle, it's based on the different approach. The 3D puzzle tends to form a contact geometry to hint at the completion of the assembly, but therefore the hollow out kind of aesthetics from the interior is hidden. But for the 2D puzzle, an opposite approach is taken and flipped inside out to show the hidden quality. And also you can see the shear orientation from the torso of the torero is also recreated as a screw layering in the puzzle. So another thing is the idea of the dual system is also applied. Like the gray base layer is composed of parts with linear aesthetics. On top of the base layer, the white layer fill of a new orientation composed of surfacey elements becomes the second system to interlock the base layer. So in the catalog, the original pieces from the torero models are brought back as our 2D puzzle and flipped inside out to show the hidden quality. So for the assembly, the puzzle is composed of a crisscross pattern. Each system will include 3 units. And the first key element is a unique sequence from torso, assembly of torero. And the white layer fill as a second system to fix the base layer. And last part would be the key and the keyhole as the major elements to create final interlocking for the whole puzzle. And the metal key as a rotational pin also become the major connection for the following development of the sighting model.
And then we are coming to the detail part. In the interior of the museum, there are 3 details in various scales from large to small, which is the core, display case, and the stairs. In the Torero puzzle, the torso part is mainly assembly through sliding. Taking the form of that part from the 2D puzzle, the core in the atrium is created by a certain level of disassembly and repetition. So by rewinding the assembly operation of the sliding, spaces are created for the stairs and handrail details. Abstracting those hollowed shapes from the plan profile of the Torero puzzle, the shoulder and the legs components are turning into columns, platform, weightless display surface, and lighting elements in the gallery space. Like the core detail, the components here are interlocking with each other, creating a vertical connection between floors. The interface part of the display case to the floor are turned into line works to amplify the interlocking operation between elements. Another interesting way of the assembly here is the L-shaped movement of the collar part. That way of interlocking made us to rethink about the connections of the steps and the beams. And by rescaling the chest part, the steps and handrail are designed into a continuous whole. At the same time, 2 variations of steps are joined together with the operation of the pivot from the 3D puzzle. The 3D puzzle components are mostly about solid and opaque. Therefore, when applied into the detailed design, finer grain line works are added in, giving them a lightweight as well as continuous look.
With the siting, we first studied the site situated in Taylor Yard in LA to study the basic logistical challenges and issues of access, views, and orientation. We made some decisions of linking the LA River to the Rio de LA State Park from the west to the east by cutting through the building's axis with another running adjacent to the existing railroad as an elevated trail. We felt it was important to position our landscapes and buildings in this orientation to bring people across a bridge to the park and establish a relationship through their building to the rest of the site. South-facing glass facades would provide plenty of natural light into the Natural History Museum. With these issues in mind, we then begin to develop our proposal as a series of assembled parts, engaging these parts while keeping specific relationships to the site in mind. Formal characteristics and operations from our earlier systems are interlaid with these original qualities as a strategic organizational method of assembly for our site and building. By reappropriating skewed layers of sculptural elements from our 2D puzzle, part of the figural contours of the landscape are being excavated out as voids, while some existed as interconnected multiples throughout the site. We have scattered volumetric pieces across the landscape through movements and extracted from our puzzle, such as sliding and interlocking into each other. These elements are translated into a network of bridges, platforms, and connections towards the north, appearing as placeholders for pavilions, which might start to occupy the site in the future. An elevated walkway permeates through these parts and ultimately takes pedestrians into the opposite end of railroad tracks parallel to the park. The ambiguity of a site-to-building relationship is continued by adapting the rotational pin and lock principles originated from the Barco piece. These repeated form of insertion acts to initiate the assembly sequence, which physically ties the building mass into place as interlinked volumes. The process of sequential behavior and the manipulation of pivotal action further emphasize a number of spatial flexibility and expansive conditions within the building. In a sense, the continuation of topography to buildings contains its presence as well as its absence in a set of superpositions and material curation and dialogue with adjacent buildings. This is where operations over transformed puzzles form part-to-whole connections that move beyond the outer surface or mass of the scheme and reveal interior continuations in the museum, for example, that is shown here at the entrance of the museum. Layer-filled parts are embedded and translated with a different scalar relationship to the entire puzzle, acting as bridges and cantilevered terraces that bring people across and over the rail tracks. Interstitial configurations blurring the internal and external, implied from the contradictory language of both continuity and rupture, is depicted in the section here. It exploits the ambiguity of the interconnectedness of the components and their programmatic relationships in a hierarchical approach. These disparate parts provide a framework for transitional spaces and programs of different functions to occur through their assembly operations. This highlighted underground space where the building is assembled and interlocked with the site contains museum offices, archive storage space, and parking spaces. It is also illustrated here as voids with a progression of height difference embedded within the overall landscape. The heightened archway in the middle serves as the main entry of the building from the south, which directs visitors to the core circulation and distinguishes public venues to the right and private ones on the left. Here are some detailed shots of the described moments suggesting its spatial quality through kinetic formations of the puzzle, as well as the way of how core circulation is inserted as a sectional puzzle piece within the museum. Spaces at the bottom right corner, anchored with another pivotal pin, house a multi-level gallery hall. Large swaths of the museum are taken up by circular glass vitrines for temporary exhibitions and permanent displays. The upper floors would be used as an educational center, museum store, workshop spaces, and a semi-outdoor social space at the top level for gardens for various purposes and restaurants. Here, the vitrines are adapted and incorporated into the walls as a vertical connection that latches onto the floor, then rotates and slides into their final positions. On the left is a secondary entrance from the east that can be accessed via a footbridge with outdoor seating, leading to special event spaces, the library and the planetarium. This spatial condition is created by the horizontal pin to serve as a more discrete entry that interacts with the existing and added site elements. A series of shifted openings between the misfit parts resulted as an S-shaped glass curtain wall in the central atrium space, and light wells at various scale and height punctured into the building mass. We have developed this strategy in order for natural daylight to flood into programs even at ground level. This further exaggerates the relationship between ground manipulation and programmatic spaces that interlock within as one entity. The progress of assemblies implied through movement fully demonstrate the variations of how unexpected visual pockets are formed, as well as the ways these physical compositions and manifestations connect in continuation, not only from the exterior to the interior, but also a parts to whole relationship that ties us back to our original puzzles through the means of multi-scaling. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
The dreaded Zoom silence. I'll just jump in. I think it's really beautiful work. I want to start there. I mean, I'm always impressed by the just the intensity and the high level of production that I see whenever I come back to SCI reviews. And that's certainly the case here. I think that, you know, the presentation is super clear. I think your development of this as a, you know, out of the prompt and really seeing what is the potential of puzzle pieces, et cetera. I can see that very clearly at the formal level. I can see how it kind of resonates with the skeletons in the museum, which is a nice little bonus. But one thing that you didn't talk a ton about, and I'd love to hear more, are the potential, let's call them tectonic possibilities that might emerge from this. I mean, I look at this work and I see it in a kind of dialogue with some similar explorations that Tom Wiscombe has been pursuing lately. You know, so if you've seen the tower that he recently finished on Sunset Boulevard that's made out of super components as opposed to more conventional pieces of architectural hardware. I can see a lot of relationships there. And I wonder if you've thought about, or if you've noticed certain advantages or possibilities with respect to how a building is put together, as opposed to how it's, you know, it seems that you have emphasized the kind of formal possibilities of the puzzle as model. And I wonder about the tectonic possibilities. I mean, did that enter into your conversations as you work through this with Dwayne?
Yeah, I think we do talk about these questions, but I think eventually for we kind of like for the building, the scale is relatively big, and it's really difficult to think of it as a puzzle pieces in the construction process. But for the detailed model development, I think we do use this kind of approach, like for the detail 3, the staircase. It's truly possible to use to assemble this staircase as a puzzle, like piece by piece.
Yeah, I can certainly see that at the scale of the staircase. But I mean, for me, I can see possibilities at a larger scale. And I look at this site with railroad tracks and difficulty of staging and things like that. And I wonder if the advantages of working with larger, possibly shop constructed elements that are then fitted together on site, rather than building the building up out of more conventional pieces. So I think that the logic that you very clearly developed in the stair, which is super beautiful, by the way, I see possibilities there in the larger pieces, but the possibilities are less developed, right? So I can see, you know, the copper pieces and the dark gray pieces and the light gray pieces, and I can see how they come together. I wonder how they're joined. You know, I mean, this is a project that makes me wonder a lot about how you would build it and how the process of building it would inform its aesthetics. You know, are these independent freestanding pieces? Do they rely on each other to hold themselves up? How do loads get transferred from one piece to the next? I mean, to me, these are all really interesting questions that would reinforce some of the visual achievements that I think you've clearly made. So I don't know. I mean, is that Dwayne? Am I moving things in a weird direction, or?
No, it's a very fair question. I mean, certainly there are some things you mentioned that they didn't talk about, but that was the intention of the details in many ways. What you're doing is sort of minding the gap between the details themselves and then the components of the building.
Exactly.
And so there wasn't discussion of that, you know, how those two things exactly work together from a tectonic standpoint. So it's a good question, and that you're in that in-between zone.
But at the same time, there is a lot of suggestions within the analytical stage of the project, where the mechanical interlocking and assembly starts working between the 2D and the 3D to kind of create the logic for the super component, which doesn't necessarily visually transfer into the building itself, but it's kind of present within the nature of the project itself. It is an incredible project, and I think that the awkward pause on the beginning of a Zoom Todd mentioned is sometimes there is so much work and there are so many potential way how to absorb or discuss the work. And this project definitely gives me a pause. So you guys have done a really amazing job. Just to start with, I think that the interlocking, the kind of an interscale logic where the interlocking on the component scale transfers into from mechanical to spatial is, I think, what you're talking about, where it's sort of on a building scale seems to operate the same way as if it was suggestive of how things are put together rather than how things are organized. And that is where the presentation creates the gap. But at the same time within, and maybe you can go to that 2D study, which to me, it's very not 2D, but where, let's call it that, where that was really kind of a reeling moment of this idea of kind of a components part or chunks that start producing assembly, which from the flatness produce different depths and different possibilities of enclosures, where the mechanism of the interlocking, the mechanical interlocking can start produce the kind of the spatial suggestions. And I think that the building kind of assumes that, or the proposal on a large scale assumes that. But that to me, that's the key. And as beautiful as the stair is, to me, it's essentially less interesting than it is interesting, but I'm just saying that the kind of a connection between this and, let's say, the bigger chunk, where you start understanding that that a bigger chunk has sort of a different tectonic operations, because the way how the load transfers is embedded within how the pieces are put together. And you can really choreograph that in a sort of an unusual way. I think that that's the part that to me is super exciting about your project. And the stairs is beautiful. It does remind me of Dwayne's and Jenny's work, where it becomes more of a kind of a tracing of a super component with the line, as opposed to looking at the chunks and how the chunk pieces start sort of looking at a sort of a structural DNA of the bigger pieces themselves.
It's interesting, Dana, because I would have thought it's a beautiful, incredibly comprehensive presentation, and it brings up so many issues. I'm trying to think where to start. There seems to be a kind of an issue between whether you're interested in the assembly part of the project that Dwayne introduced, which is constructional and material based, and which shows up in the stair, versus whether it's an organizational idea, which shows up in your planning of the total project. And this could be an issue here because of the scale that it's going to come up. And I'm not quite clear that you're clear on those two very different kind of roles, or if they, in fact, the coalescence of those two is the nature of the project. But when you get to the larger scale, where you need organizational ideas, is where there's a problem. And the problem is you're asking completely different questions that have nothing to do with either the idea as an organizational idea, the assembly, or as a material idea, that you're looking at issues that have to do with macro urban infrastructural site issues. And you need another, the strategy is no longer useful, in my opinion, to you, that you need an additional kind of strategy as it has to do with the planning. But on the other one, on the architecture, it's interesting. Something you said, Dana, reminded me that the stair assembly seems to develop a complete attitude towards the total project. If you take it in its material sense, and it's very kind of 70s for me, it'd be kind of where we were mucking around with in the 70s and 80s, and having to do with scalar elements that start developing a very kind of handmade notion. But we were kind of aware that it was very 19th century. It wasn't Buckminster Fuller. It's
very Art Nouveau.
This is not minimum redundancy, maximum relevance.
It looks like a Hortaz landscape in Art Nouveau era, 19th century era. It's very,
and it's
very much referential to that. You're right.
But I think what happens I would have thought that as you look at these as assemblies, that the stair no longer has the singular purpose of stair in terms of vertical movement. That it's now much closer. If you've looked at the way Boeing puts together a 737, they come as assemblages from different countries, right? The cockpit's made in France and the wing assembly's made in Japan, and they come as a total assembly. In an architecture, that means structure, mechanical, MEP, all that kind of stuff comes singular, and then they're clipped together. It seems like that would be a more useful model to you in terms of the starting with the puzzle, that each of these elements, in fact, is integrated and it's synthesized with all the systems, and now challenges the stair for me. That never is there really a stair as a singular item. That is a part of an assembly, which is multivalent, right? It performs multiple tasks. And that would be, for me, it may be the kind of major, kind of broader comment of your project, that, or the things that you're questioning, that belongs to Dwayne and Jenny in terms of the broader kind of ambition of the project.
I think that they started out with scale of object, which when they put together, the structurally or the connections and everything is working in that scale. But still, I'm not sure the material of this object is not clear. So if it's really working in that way, and then my question is that when you expand that scale into bigger scale, you had to go into more detail to expand each element, and then the end it's become urban scale. So that kind of description should be emphasized a little more. I'm sure it's in there, but it's not clear for me.
Maybe just to jump in, I think, you guys did an amazing job. And I think the videos are super interesting to me, especially going back to Todd's initial comment about, how you build this versus maybe how you assemble this. And I think that, in some ways, because the pieces, and this goes back to the whole interscalability of the initial puzzle, these things were about this big and things that you can assemble like a model. And but and as you jump scale to the bigger project, I think it's really interesting because I think you guys carefully kind of curated some of these, like some pieces could be dropped in, but you dropped it in by like first rotating it and then sort of fit it into that moment. And so at the end, your project feels very assembled. And that, I think it's a good thing. But that's different than, how you may actually build it. And so, I wonder at the end how to, whether, how to reconcile the kind of constructability of a thing that is how you might conceive of it as a set of assembly versus how you actually build the building, and how do you merge that gap between those?
But at the same time, that when it became a big scale, it's no longer you can do by hand how to put these pieces together by hand. So there is something that they should bring the machinery part of the construction should be putting into this project, and then the machinery doesn't need to be typical cranes and big trucks and things like that, but they can also invent these components of machines into the project, which also should be part of the infrastructure of the site.
Yeah, what's interesting there, Nanako, is that with the rail line right there, you could imagine designing this thing, where the pieces pull up on a rail car that has an arm on it, and they just kind of get stuck on the site. I mean, I think that this site in particular really kind of screams out for exactly that kind of investigation.
Yeah, maybe they can go into the utilizing ley lines to really assemble these components of the buildings. I don't know, we can call these components as a buildings.
But at the same time, I think that on a building scale, on a large scale, the maybe it's the way the presentations is self-similar when you put together the little pieces of the assembly for facade-like chunk or so on to the site animation where you put the objects together as a spaces is self-similar. So it suggests same kind of assembly across scales, but it's not. I mean, it can be, right? And I don't think that the scale of those components would be even constructed that way. To me, it's not the translation or kind of interscalability of assembly. It's in the way I read this project, it's embedded within the chunk. It's kind of it's sort of the chunk itself has a parts of pieces. So the large scale is purely organizational. And I completely agree with what Nanako said, that the organization was unclear as to if that was, the logic was more compositional or it was related to some form of functionality. It seemed that the daylight was really a driving component. So I can see how looking at the kind of a spatial composition with sort of a carving the daylight, this idea of a kind of a spatial component or a chunk that has a seam or a crack that then starts dealing with interiority and exteriority in a way that it allows that sort of a penetration of inside and outside in different ways. It's much more of a kind of a sculpting strategy on the building scale, but I still think that the sort of a literality of how this is being assembled, built, constructed, and so on is not part of that. It's not kind of a one-to-one relationship. I think that's embedded in a kind of a smaller chunks and these assemblies that might not necessarily produce this sort of a smooth surfaces, but might be more articulated because of that kind of a puzzling occurs within a different scale. So to me, that the strategy sort of translate from like the facade component can be assembled. It offers the sort of a, figure of a chunk that produces a seam between the chunks, and that seam is then programmed in a completely different way. And I in a way, I like that. I feel like that should be maybe a little bit more explicit as just trying to say, like, this is how the construction is being translated from, the wall to sort of a 2,000 square feet large building.
Well, you know, one way that you might pursue that investigation would be, you know, just think about how pieces go together and what you need to put them together, right? So there are a lot of pieces in architecture that are, you know, 4x8 is about the maximum dimension because like one person or two people can kind of handle that piece. And then you kind of scale up to things that require a crane. And then you scale up to things that will fit on a truck. And I think to think seriously about those kinds of parameters, you know, how much does a piece weigh versus how big is it? How big of a thing can I put on a truck and get to the site, or put on a train car and get to the site? And I think that those would introduce characteristics to the individual pieces that I think would enrich the project. You know, so when we look at the stair and we see pieces that for the most part, one or two people could wrangle. But then we look at these you know, these small buildings that argue for being put into place, you know, all of a piece. How that happens is an interesting question. And I do think that, you know, taking that into account as you think about these pieces going together would be a really useful thing for the students to think about. It's something that's not often thought about in studios in school, for instance. And I think this is a project, and I think this is a studio that seems to invite those kind of questions. You know, how much does something weigh? How big a thing can you put on a truck, et cetera. You know, I really wonder, I wish that the colors were doing more, you know, so if I looked at the copper pieces and understood them as having certain material or tectonic qualities, and the dark gray pieces as having different qualities. At the moment, it's not at all clear what the differences are, other than they're, you know, they're kind of visually articulated, but it's not clear that they are tectonically differentiated with the same kind of strength.
Todd, are you saying that you want a color coding indexing the component organization?
No, I'm saying right now it's color coded.
No, but I think it's not. I think I agree with you. It's not color coded, but that's in a way that is part of the aesthetic language that sort of translates the idea of a larger whole to this discrete parts, and how those parts are coming together. To me, there's sort of the deliberate ambiguity between spatial, kind of a spatial assembly and interlocking, and mechanical assembly and interlocking, which are not at all articulated in a bigger piece, and in a way that seems to me intentional, right? I'm just arguing for you guys because you're quiet.
It seems like it opens the project into some very different types of questions. I was where you were going, Todd, and I was thinking of when they were developing the Gerberettes for the Pompidou.
Yeah.
They were being produced in Germany, and they're being shipped down the Rhine. And I'm looking at the site plan now, going, the kind of questions you'd ask is that the issues don't seem to be leading to traditional site planning issues. If you use assembly as if you prioritize assembly as the project, they're coming in on a barge. And then with that, the students are going to be interested in what is the largest capacity to lift something. And they're going to find it's 55 feet long. It's the length of a truck assembly. And it's, I forget, it's like 35 tons. And they're going to be more interested in inventing a crane or in developing a process that lets them produce the scale of pieces that they need for this scale of project. And it leads you down a very, very interesting path, where instead of the river being traditionally seen as kind of an edge condition urbanistically, it's seen as a transportation device. And you're interested that it's coming from someplace, and it's very much parallel to something like Pompidou, because they wanted the Gerberettes a little larger, if I remember right. And they also had to make them out of titanium because they were too heavy, and I forgot the specifics now, but they were concerned by the weight and the length as they were being shipped to this middle site in Paris, right? And it just offers really interesting kind of issues, right? And then the assembly, it's really not doing this, it's doing something else as it connects. It is connecting, but it's not quite as literal as the puzzle, having to do the architectural, right, relationship to this assembly process.
But that's such a 19th century notion of the the river, right? It's the sort of the port, the industrial, the rise of the industrial city, the kind of architecture, the constructions of the sort of a global system. But one can look at it also through, much more discrete modes of production, smaller parts that assemble into the bigger chunk, which are, if you look at the kind of a human robot space, which is looking at way of producing architecture of different assemblages as sort of a new forms of democracy or democratizing labor. It starts operating on slightly different scale. It's not about the kind of what's the biggest part we can bring in one chunk. It's a sort of how this sort of a different scale of form of assemblies can produce a larger whole.
Oh,
and that would then produce, and I completely agree. I like this idea of kind of how the mechanics of the assembly start producing different forms of organization, and I think that's kind of at the core of the studio, and it's really it's brilliant. But there are also I just want to move us away from the kind of a 19th century production where the being far away and being in the place, and how does role of kind of manufacturing and producing some of these parts change the way we think about assembly relative to kind of a larger societal issues is actually a super interesting way to start thinking about how one constructs the what's the effect of it. It's on a kind of architectural components and so.
Absolutely. It'd be what happened with motorcycles in the 70s. The seat, the frame, the gas tank are all a single assembly now. They're not seen as isolated. But then the stair would have contained a fragment of the wall.
Yep.
Something that represents the mechanical structural nation. Right? They're going to immediately reorganize how we think about architecture components, and they're going to develop a very different organizational structure.
All right, great. With that, we're going to jump to the next one. While they're getting theirs up, I want to comment on this. You're all in a territory, honestly, we haven't talked about, and it's kind of funny that we haven't. You asked earlier, Tom, you said there's two different issues here. There's the organizational, and then there's the assembly. And I guess I've always thought of the use of that word assembly as the overarching idea, as having a more broad meaning it might mean organizational at one scale. It might mean organizational, for example, on the scale of the building's assembly to the building's relationship to the site. It might mean a kind of spatial interlock in relation to the program, and it might mean tectonic at the scale of a detail. So it can be aesthetic, it can be organizational, and it can be tectonic. So I want to say it's, each of these puzzle pieces inherently have characteristics that do things like they insert themselves deep into another to find a form of interlock. They reach completely around another piece in order to create a form of interlock. All things that are useful at the scale of a tectonic assembly, but are also very useful from the standpoint of thinking about organizational relationships of parts. The issues of assembling components absolutely should be an issue that's a part of this, but something we haven't talked about to the degree you're all bringing up. So,
but now that's the assumption would be then, in terms of this conversation, would be that you can find an alignment between the puzzle as an organizational idea, as a spatial idea, and a constructional idea, that they in fact align. Because I would, one of the issues, it would be a question mark. Do they align, right? Yeah. The organizational idea might require a very specialized assembly idea.
That's
in terms
true.
of translating it into materiality, let's say, right?
Absolutely.
It'd be a big question then, right? Whether those in fact are simultaneous.
Right.
Got it.
Okay, Barak and Devangi.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
My name is Barak.
And I'm Devangi.
Let me pull this up.
My selected piece is Better Call's Romeo and Juliet because we chose Romeo and Juliet because of its abstraction of a couple, a curvy linear exterior and an angular interior. Both these qualities being so different yet come together to make a complete whole. This is an animation to portray that.
So Berkol's main mechanism is hinge rotation, which rotates from one side and hinges to create the armature of the puzzle on which the elevation pieces are assembled. And so the second one is the slide lock, the technique. The main sectional pieces play a role of a keystone that balances and locks both elevation pieces together. And then the other one is the slide pad. So this is another key characteristics of the puzzle. It's a strategy. It is strategically place the secondary sectional pieces onto the armature. And these are some, so moving to the 3D puzzle, our transformation started by understanding the key components of the puzzle that holds the Berkol together. Creating different levels of complexity and sizes in the puzzle was an important transformation strategy. Each piece has a unique character and form, yet they create a complete whole.
Sequence is very crucial in assembling and disassembling a puzzle. Each piece has at least one key characteristic and strategy of the design that helps the puzzle develop further. A strategy that restricts open-ended movements and a specific geometric interface to generate the assembly of deriving to a complete whole.
So,
this is the assembly of the puzzle. We developed a puzzle considering the concept of a multi-tool. Unlike the original Berkol, a multi-tool has hinges on both the ends. By taking the original concept of slide lock and slide tap, we transformed the puzzle into a locking assembly technique that acts as a keystone as a whole. One thing we wanted to develop from the original Berkol was to derive at a complete whole and to highlight the sectional porosity of the original object on the facade. And those are expressed through the exterior cutouts or reveals.
and we want to make the transformed pieces more readable in terms of their materiality to distinguish the unique characteristic in its entirety. Therefore, unlike the original Berkol, which is brass metal, we experimented with multiple materials deriving into a matte finish black oxide and metal plates finish paired with a contrasting coffee stained poplar tree wood. And then moving to the 2D puzzle, taking the reveals as an advancement strategy, we started working on the 2D puzzle by superpositioning the reveals on the topography. This technique is developed further by using the depth of the 2D puzzle juxtaposed with the movement of the pieces. So we are continuing the dynamic strategy of the transform piece of hinge rotation, slide lock, and slide tap. 2D puzzle works in the sequence of a coupled pieces as seen in this diagram, and it is conceptually derived from the original Romeo and Juliet. We have a video of the 2D puzzle assembly. So the strategy of coupled pieces is two pieces are hinged together independently and then locked and tapped in the original assembly sequence, generating the amorphed topography.
As the reveal was the main strategy, we wanted to highlight it by using a gold finish. To emphasize the contours and the cuts on the topography, we experimented with two distinct textured finishes, one metallic and one matte.
And moving to the detail.
We started designing the staircase that shows an advanced version of the working strategy at an architectural detail scale.
So the main technique of the detail is also a part of the original puzzling assembly: pivot, slide, and lock. The diagonal structural frame that runs through the floors interlocks the first facade panel and then consequently the others. Structure of the stair interlocks to the main frame, resulting in the development of mezzanine floors and stair landings. And this puzzling technique helps us develop a system that the exterior 10 by 20 feet GFRC panels and the diagonal structural systems are working together.
These are some drawings illustrating how these staircases or the detail looks.
The GFRC panels assembled on the outside, working together with the main frame.
To understand the placement, orientation, and human scale for the design, we started understanding the site, the access points, and the accessibility to our design. We carved out the site, the access point, we carved out the site so that the river can cut through the site, creating a public-friendly kayak launch with the museum. The building was oriented along the southwest-northeast axis, which is now accessed by two vehicular routes along the road from the park and the bridge across the river. 3 pedestrian and cycling routes from the park, road, and the bridge. The whole site is carved out with the niches and gaps to create multiple spaces with the landscape.
So the museum is positioned and locked into place by the two main pedestrian access points from the two sides, the golden pathways. The golden pathways are human scale illustrations of what the reveal did in our 2D assembly, cutting the geometry. These locking points would be the entrances to the lobby on the ground level. The museum is also accessed from the northeast front through a series of staircases. In terms of materiality, we kept the original materials from our 3D transformation, black oxide and metal finish, contrasted with a mahogany wood.
The section is cut right through the center of the museum from the northeast entrance that leads to the multi-story lobby in the center. It reaches the kayak launch theater and underground exhibition space. Vertical exhibition spaces and atriums highlight the architectural detail of the staircase system. The elevation. These are the vertical and the horizontal exhibition spaces that highlight the staircase assembly and how the GFRC panels come together. We took the multi-tool pivot mechanisms and converted them into an experiential exhibition spaces that connected multiple forms spaces together. For example, one of the hinges becomes an experiential space to understand the sun and shadow through heliodons, which is connected to another hinge that becomes an experiential study for the solar system.
So our history museum, by taking puzzling as a strategy, aims for the sophistication, richness, and variety of cultures and ages coming together like a puzzle piece, making a whole. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys are being way more explicit about the interlocking being used in much more kind of a metaphorical way when it comes to scaling up the principles of the components and from the object to the organization of the building. So I think that makes this very, very legible. I have a question. It's a beautiful project, again. I have a question. How does the first 2D pattern that you developed with the seams, is there a sort of a economy of scale relative to how the kind of a assembly piece, how the detail of the interlocking, is it repetitive at all, or
So
is it varies every time?
So it varies every time, and the way we were like tackling this as a puzzling is how we can assemble the coupled pieces first, and then make it part of the whole. And so that way you don't see the mechanism underneath, but only you can understand it by rotating the pieces, interlocking them, rotating them, and then think about coupled pieces of the coupling. I think that was one strategy.
And when you turn the piece, is it one-sided, or when you turn it around, do you actually see can you puzzle out the mechanism of interlocking, or is it always hidden?
If we turn the puzzle, yes, we can see the mechanism. It works like it's just tap, slide, and rotate.
I see. I mean, it's a really smart piece, and there's kind of a structural logic to the components themselves, that you understand them as an object itself, and the assembly itself produces certain variation within its landscape. When you can transition into and I like this idea of kind of a hidden seam or revealing the seam as a strategy for building architectural concept. And I wonder if that really translates into your organization of your building, as well as in your 3D part. There's also this sort of a weirdness between where the whole building is becoming, it's using the assembly in a 3D pieces. And some of those have slightly different geometry, as like some parts are kind of thick and solid, have a kind of a tectonic consistency, and then some part becomes sort of very wispy, and they're becoming kind of fillers of I think it was where is the one where you have a 3D part when you disassembled?
Yeah.
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah. It's the one of the bigger one, I think. But so so I'm kind of wondering in terms of the component itself, and then the component itself, and then the mechanism of assembly are two different things. And in a way that frees the form or the shape of a component away from the mechanism of how it's being joined, which or there is always the kind of a rigidity between how the joint works and what are the constraints of the sort of the component themselves. Because I think that can be really, to me, the building and the siding of the building is almost less interesting as a project, and generally within a studio. No, that is not interesting. It's just my own fascination. It's the sort of the mechanism of how the interlocking relative to the shape of the components start produce the different forms of legibility relative to either continuity of material or creating internal voids, as a kind of architectural set of architectural strategies that you can really harvest, right? And because when you come to the building scale, you kind of take the external form and you carve it out as a sort of a typical architectural building space, and which is very well done. The section is excellent, right? But it's almost like it's a found form within a side, then it's that being architecturalized through the kind of the traditional form of drawing the section. and using some of the parts of the material, you're carving it out, but you're not necessarily using the same strategy relative to how the form of a components fall together to create voids or opaque spaces or relative to interiority and exteriority. So I'm not sure if I'm being fully clear, but so that interscalar jump, it's then being much more formal than the sort of a rigor by which you create these assemblies and joineries and components. And maybe it's because the two early models essentially produce just kind of a solid volume rather than they play within the kind of a space between the joint on a form, how it can create the void within. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, Donna. I was thinking very similar things as I looked at this, the kind of, the very elegant tight fit of the models does seem to make the development of a spatial sequence within the building a little harder, right? Because you've kind of, the tight tolerances have in some ways squeezed the space out of the building. And so I agree, when I look at the section, as attractive as it is, it seems to be operating by a very different logic from the assembly of the model. And a place where I could see this, and this maybe helps us, gives us a hint as to how we might move forward, are in what you're calling the hinge spaces, right? So when I look at those in the model, I see those are a mechanical element that help you put the model together. When I look at them in the section, they're round volumes, right? But if I think about how hinge is often used in the history of plan making, if I look at Hadrian's Villa, for instance, and I look at the kind of circular elements that help to organize a transition from one organizational system to another, there's a spatial logic to hinges that is very much a part of the vocabulary of our field. And there's also a mechanical logic of hinges that is equally a part of the vocabulary of our field. And when I look at this section, I immediately start thinking, well, if, the ancient Romans showed us a thing or two about how spatial hinges might work, and that lesson has, continues to be learned. You can see it in the work of every architect on this panel, for instance. I wonder what is the sectional version of that? Because it does seem to me that, to me anyway, when I think of a hinge, in architecture, I tend to think toward plans. I mean, maybe this is my own weird bias towards, the kind of Roman space. But I look at those circles in the section in particular, and I wonder, could they begin to become a moment where different systems of spaces within the project, where transitions are made between different spaces in the project? Because right now the hinge piece seems very self-contained, and that to me seems like if they were able to break open, we could start to understand their organizational possibilities.
Are you talking about hinge as the circular spatial on the section?
Yeah, so I look at this, for instance, and the circle is closed. Here,
yeah,
possibly more productive because the circle opens up, and this circle opens up differently. Mm-hmm. But you see that if I think of, if we thought of a plan very simply that worked like that, the hinge kind of transitions us from one mode to the other. These are kind of independent of the spaces that are adjacent. Or Frank Lloyd Wright, as Dwayne says.
I think the section is very interesting. The previous project had, they go through a lot of different transformation of forms and the mechanical parts and then the scale differences. But at the end of the day, their buildings are all organized as a slab buildings, and it's become like quite normal. So that was a little bit disappointing. Even project was really advanced and beautiful. And this project, when you see these sections, the circular organization is breaking that typical slab building ideas, and then as the slab became more part of the circulations, like stairs and circulation system, which becoming very interesting here, and then I really like it that way. Is this that this studio is emphasized on the staircase? Both of project talked about staircase.
They could have
No, we
chosen
had
any detail they wanted, but several of the groups chose a stair.
Yes.
You know, because it's often the moment where the movement occurs and things sort of intersect from a public standpoint. So many of them chose that.
Okay.
I think, Todd, at that point, I just love that point about the hinge. I do think that it could exist in sectional form in the way you're talking about, where it doesn't rely on the center to create the magic, but the things that sort of you know, splay off of it. It doesn't necessarily mean that the ones that they have don't work, because they are programs that kind of want isolation. You know, the Heliodon, for example, it wants to be isolated. But where the kind of space you're calling for works really well is where the stair's located, essentially, where that space might kind of filter into other areas. It's a beautiful point about the hinge, and it's not the way the hinge looks exactly, but it is the way the hinge operates.
Boy, I'm going to come at it quite differently, and I'm because I really don't agree with most of the comments I have to say. But I want to say first to students, Todd, you're smiling because nothing new, right? Very beautiful, incredibly comprehensive, rigorous project that's going to serve you well as architects, and a consistency of thinking, which is going to serve you well. And I just have issues with certain broad notions of the project, which is easier to talk about because of the consistency and the comprehensiveness of the way you've dealt with this project. For me, I think that, again, there's a beginning. There's an ambiguity between this thing as a kind of a finished object, and it's radically over aestheticized in my terms. If it's seen as an operational strategy, it's just part of a process, the puzzle making, the whole kind of notion of reconfiguring some organization that has to do with these certain kind of ideas of how these things fit together three-dimensionally and how they produce, well, three-dimensional, two-dimensional kind of surface to a final thing. And so you look at finally the object, and it requires a specificity of shape, which is this continuity that allows you to understand the puzzle in the most basic way. And it produces an object. And the question would be, is this building even an object building? Because you just answered huge issues. That would be the first questions I would ask in terms of a project, right? Its relationship to the site and whether it even has an isolation as an object. And then with that, when you get to the section, it's literal, impossible that the spatial connection is going to have anything to do with the program. It's going to be a general model as an idea for something that you're going to start over with again, because it'd be impossible that that a prioriness would be to the extreme, right? And ditto with the site plan. And you look at a site plan, and it's a beautiful thing, as is the first one. There are these, and then the first one, blow it up, son, you even have these little lines. It's incredibly specific as an object. And it gives it an incredible kind of rigor. Go to the object itself, the very beginning. And it ends up being found in the final model as windows, I believe, these cuts or whatever. But the operations you made in this have to do with this object, this stuff, everything. The lines in the wood, everything. And it's clear, right? And there's an enormous coherence in the language that you put this thing together. And the question would be its usefulness. which of these aspects are finally leading to the project? And again, whether some of it's constructional, assembly, and some of it is organizational, spatial. Because I would have thought if you're going to articulate this model and talk about it spatially, you possibly would put together a very different model. You could have used origami. I mean, we could go through different methods of the rules that have been this thing. And you would come up with a very different kind of set of ideas based if you shifted the rules or if you shifted the demands of this thing in terms of how you see this being useful to you architecturally. And then you go to the 2D. And again, the 2D again is they're beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. And I'm just asking a question: how does this now start forming a site strategy? Because it seems to have a very clear idea of a very a sense of surface on a couple levels. Three-dimensionally as it's sculpted in particular ways, and then the color differentiation, which again produces another kind of an order, and it would just start leading you to a broad idea of a site plan. And by the way, the relationship of the object on this, and I would think one of the questions would be, what is the relationship of the object in this thing? Because I'm going to say one of the attitudes that'd be similar. That today that you can talk about architecture, landscape and architecture have done this for quite a while now, but that'd be now a particular conceptual direction versus the object. And if it's an object, then what is again the relationship? Is there some sort of a role between this form, this set of operations on the site, and the operation of the object? Ultimately, there is going to be some connection. And here we go again. You've changed the site more, I think. Am I correct? Than the object.
Right.
The site, that's what's going to happen. Whatever the rules are, you don't tell us. You change site operations, and it has something to do with various performances, right? Either broad notions of its relationship to the broader site, its connectivity, or to its relationship to the object. And there's stuff going on there. There's public space, there's infrastructure of various types, et cetera. And then this assembly no longer makes sense. It doesn't really, you don't do this in a building. You use the same idea, but now it has to do with a very, very different kind of notion of scale, size of the pieces, et cetera. But again, it leads to an extremely kind of interesting idea that would lead you to this, the site especially here, because it seems like now you've molded that. You didn't tell us why. It'd been really useful for us to understand now how this transforms, because now you're operating as an architect, right? It's no longer a purely conceptual object. Right. And here you tell us a little bit, but you don't concentrate on it. It's really not the discussion, but it seems like that you do understand, right? That this is a broad idea that now is turning into something else. And you don't quite show us how it moved from it changed quite radically, by the way, right? The coloration it seemed like you were also purposely erasing one sculptural idea with another idea of the coloration. Am I correct? That was intentional in the site plan? Because that had been, go back to your original plan, which doesn't operate on their object. Go back to the conceptual one, your 2D puzzle. Because it seems like, there's an absolutely purposeful notion of erasure. That you have one organization which shapes it three-dimensionally, and you have another one that violates that in some of its orthogonal, right? And that's the intention. Somehow that tension between these two things taking place. And it would lead you to a broad idea, right? Of this thing, that you're using these two, right? Kind of oppositional strategies in a purposeful way. And they're gonna have something to do with the location of the object, if there is an object. Because that object could have been submerged in different ways, right? It's super open to interpretation. And it seems like, to me, that's the most interesting part of the project. It is extremely kind of open to multiple interpretations.
I really like that, because I think it's at the center of what you said earlier about what is at the core of puzzle making. Like, what does puzzle making reveal that can become architecturally effective? And so this idea of kind of a underlying regularity within a structure that is then kind of masked or intentionally characterized through these different patterns or seams or connectivities and disconnectivities. There's sort of multiple layers of information which are sort of put together through some form of assembly logic that is that intelligent assembly logic that sort of produces the object is, I think, really incredible in the studio. And
Eric,
I love that.
On again. Put the overall puzzle on again. Because when Deanna just started talking about it, I realized that if it was a real puzzle, the 2D.
The 2D puzzle.
The 2D puzzle. If this was just a square and you weren't engaged in the shape of the piece like a traditional puzzle, and there were squares, the only way you could put it together was the surface, because the surface gives you the clues now, right? Meaning that the other one is either less differentiated or differentiated to an extent so it makes it more difficult, and the coloration allows you to understand it with a different kind of language, right? It gives it a specificity. I would say that's a direct connection to an architectural idea. If you use these things that operate with different performances, that give the specialization that you're required as you change the final scheme, right? That you have two different strategies, two different methods going about doing this, right? And again, it alludes to, I assume, the silver and the gold or the copper allude to, again, in terms of the assembly, the man-made. If it's an augmented nature, it's the man-made nature that's more overt versus the more traditional nature, which is left organic. Am I right? That it leads to that. And because I'm going to say one of these things is the building. If I didn't know the scale, the middle silver one is the work. And it becomes more three-dimensional. I have no idea. And now you're applying a broader kind of notion of the whole relationship of building and the landscape that's representing kind of a commitment to a broader ecological idea.
Great. Maybe let's go to the next one. Thank you, Barak and Dwangi.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I think you're touching on an aspect now that I personally find really interesting about the puzzles, which is just like the cognitive issues related to them and the use of that in thinking about architectural issues. By that, I mean the idea that two pieces with a clear relationship to one another through their positives, negatives, their form language, potentially create charged spaces, or the sense that they connect, or the sense that they were once connected, even when they're not. And maybe this is probably, of all that we have, the one where the pieces are the most tight fit. And so you don't sense the sense of that charge, or the sense that they were connected inside the building. You do start to sense a lot of it around the building, meaning it's kind of nestled itself into the site, pushed things around, looked like it got shifted. And so you're seeing a lot of that happening on the site itself.
I was thinking about this before I came this morning, because I've seen earlier versions of this. Have you considered the puzzle being more virtual? Dana brought up 19th century in terms of the conversation with assembly, and I agree with you 100%. If these weren't even solid, it's a conceptual puzzle, but it's still vapor, meaning they could be void or solid, or some combination thereof. Because when I looked at the section, I'm going, I would have thought one of those chunks was the void, not drawing it literally with lines.
Right.
On the section, no offense to those guys, because the project was beautiful, but it's literal and kind of boring. No, I'm going, no, I'm gonna look at a section that I haven't seen before, right? Because I've got a very, very different idea of the thing I'm cutting. But if you saw some of them if it was, the whole thing was virtual, would that kind of shift it a bit?
Well, it does, but it loses what I think I'm actually attracted to the physical specificity of the pieces and the idea that those offer an organizational system that you wouldn't get without looking at some characteristics of the puzzles. Now, what you bring up is not, I don't want to prevent that from being a part of the consideration. You'll see one, for example, where the piece goes away in a couple projects from now, and it produces an interesting result in that it barely exists, but it still does something. But I don't want to eliminate the pieces completely, because it's their characteristics that I think give you a place to start and to interrogate in terms of their physical characteristics. The shape matters, in other words.
Well, we discussed it the other day because you're old school at that level. I'm going to joke with you at that level. Mechanical stuff. So you're finding some new combination of that physicality. You're right. Whether there's a project still. I got it.
Right. Okay. So we're scheduled in hopes that we get you out of here when we said we would, which was 12:30. The first one always takes longer, so we're not that far off, but we have about an hour and we have 3 projects. So we're going to try to keep a pace of about 20 minutes.
Hello.
Hi, Abdullah.
Hi.
How are you?
Hope everyone is doing well. Hi, my name is Abdullah. I'm going to start with this image here because this is my initial vision of the project back in midterm before the project was fully fledged and realized. So keep that in mind while I go through the presentation because you're going to see the before and after. So starting with the precedent, I started to look at a very mechanical piece, which is the mini divot by Miguel Barricol. This piece in particular has a very mechanical assembly process that basically vertically assembles the puzzle with a very intricate complexity in the inside with different key characteristics. And here's a quick de-assembly video showing some of the qualities of this original puzzle. As many of the sculptures by Miguel, he keeps a ring embedded within the sculpture, which is being solved as he opens it. So some of the key characteristics that this particular puzzle has, or which interested me the most, is first the slide lock system, which is usually found in the base of the puzzle. Also, the two-way fit lock system, where two pieces or like two adjacent pieces are being interlocked together with a third piece that comes in perpendicular. And third is a doweled butt joint, where basically two pieces are being joined together on top of each other. So the first puzzle was the first attempt of transforming this precedent into something that could be an interesting architectural value at later stage in the semester. I wanted to work with the ideas of having contrasting geometries. In this case, I'm using capsulated curvilinear geometry on the outside with a very rigid box in the inside, keeping all the complex and intricate mechanical systems that the original puzzle has. So this is some of the pictures of the physical model with the materiality being rusted bronze on one side and granite steel on the other side. And you can see here there's a very monolithic bunker-like aesthetic to it, which I found very intimidating and interesting at the same time. Here's some detail shots. And here's a being deassembled. Both the materiality and the formal aspect is both portraying this idea of monolithic or having this bunker-like qualities, so on. So moving forward, puzzle 2 or the 2D puzzle is one where I wanted to basically continue to be inspired by the original puzzle that I had, but in this case, add another element, which is the rotational hinge, to add an element of rotation. So in this case, those flabs are, could rotate and are assembled in a very strategic and orderly fashion. So there's a very, there's an order in which these pieces can be assembled. And here's a video showing how it's being assembled from the base. The interesting thing about it, it has 2 levels, and I imagine it as being a public space where you have a transformable roof and a very open plaza underneath. This rotational aspects allow for radical reconfigurations of the site once we go into the architectural and urban scale. So puzzle 3 is just a preliminary study back in midterm where I was basically trying to create a vision for where the project would move forward back from then. And this was basically the vision that I had of combining both puzzles together, but in a more architectural scale. And this is a preliminary setting mechanism that I thought of back then. So moving forward, so now we're in Taylor Yards. It's a large, huge site, 1,800,000, almost 2 million square foot of space. So the program that I wanted to adopt is basically a museum district or a campus. So it can incorporate, of course, the main program, which is the Natural History Museum, along with research and development, a library, laboratories, and social and communal areas to revive and reactivate the site. So I wanted to look at the site from a holistic perspective and see all the problems or challenges or even opportunities that I could basically tackle. And some of the main ones that I found is the risk of flood because of the turns that the Iller River has on the site. So, there's always a risk of flooding, and it did happen before and created chaos in the area. Also, Frogtown is underdeveloped. It has a very lack of accessibility. The site itself, Taylor Yards, has only one access point, which is problematic moving forward for future developments. Another interesting thing is that there is a trail track here, and this could be utilized to allow for transit access into the site. And also, the site is basically being located between 2 mountains or hills, which creates a wind funnel effect between the 2 hills, and at the same time is an opportunity to create a landmark project because those 2 hills are basically nearby and could have a good vantage point looking into the project. So starting with the urban scale, the project here basically is not meant to present a fully fledged, fully realized conceptual idea of the project, but more about trying to solve those primary issues that I talked about. So in my case, I basically created an expansion of the Iller River where the water would sneak into the site, of course, being controlled by a water control system. So in case of a flood, the water could actually, instead of flooding the neighborhood, it could actually become part of the site, creating a mini Venice system organization, basically. The main project, the museum is here, sitting right in the corner. You have the library and you have the research centers and the communal areas here, and you have 5 access points moving forward. So here is the main problems of the site. So I connected the train into the site. I created 5 access points, 1 from the park, 1 from the other side, 2 from the other side, and 3 from this side, while incorporating nature and water and landscape as being part of the overall proposal. And here's some different vantage points of the overall urban proposal. You see the main project, which is developed, and the rest of the rest of the vision in play, creating this kind of like Venice-like infrastructure for future developments to happen. Of course, those projects on the side are not necessarily fully designed, but they're just meant to portray an idea for what could potentially be the case if another project would take place. And here's a top view of how that looks like. with the canal being dragged into the site to create a very interesting node to work with. So now starting with the architectural assembly. So as you know, I started from the reconfiguration of the puzzle one, back from the monolithic bunker-like capsulated geometry. I cracked it open, creating reconfigured massing-wise. And then 3 is where I started to imagine how the mechanics in the middle could actually incorporate some sectional qualities, and finally, you know, start to think about how am I going to set the entire project on the site. And here's some perspectives of how I ended up terraforming the site on the other side of the project, which I'm going to show more detailedly later. So here's the architectural section of the project. In this case, as you can see, it's pretty much almost resembled to the original puzzle that I had. Most of the mechanics of the original puzzle was basically incorporated into architectural sectional quality in this case, creating large atrium. And I was mainly focused on, or I was mainly interested actually in 2 main ideas. One is the idea of monolithic versus light. So what does heavy versus light mean, and how could that be interpreted in an architectural standpoint? And also the idea of porosity, or opening up the building, you know, closing versus opening, and how am I going to incorporate this void into the project, allowing for flow to take place within the project. So here's an overall programmatic diagram of how the project deals with you know, different functions. You have the exhibition halls facing the water, you have the offices in the top, you have the central atrium, the sky deck, you have the theater here, the back of house, the storage and the car parking below. You have a planetarium on the other side, and this is basically the northeast side, so it has less harmful light. So I opened up the building more, while on the southwest side, I basically kept it a little bit more conserved to prevent harsh light from creating chaos within the project. And moving into the detail scale, I was really interested in transferring those ideas of the capsulated geometry into a prototype of a staircase. So I created a semi-capsulated base for the staircase that basically wraps around the under part, while also creating this arch capsules, you know, ceilings that again reminds one of the basic problems that I was dealing with initially in this project. And here are some other perspectives showing the staircase. And here's a physical model of where the final project stands at the moment. So you can see the series of spaces, you know, maybe more clearly than the drawing. And here's some series of details. Here you can see the theater. Here looking from below into the project. Here's from the other side. This is the this is one of the entrances of the project. It's not the main one, but it's a significant one as well from the north side. And here's the back view of the model. Thank you. This wraps my presentation.
Thank you, Abdullah. It was very, very thoughtful. I have a question. When you started talking about kind of picking up on the previous conversation a little bit and looking at the sort of a characteristics of the puzzle as a both operational and inspirational input for the architecture, and it seems that in your case, when you started talking, when you showed the diagram of the capsule, the encapsulated piece with the external sort of a smooth, curvilinear surface that internally has kind of a rectangular tectonic system that puts it together, right? There's sort of a duality between linearity and curvilinearity, which is essentially, it's very sort of a, you know, if you go back to Frank Gehry, that was a sort of a strategy of making curvilinear facade as a sort of a first built way of thinking about that. So there's a sort of a dissociation of the facade and the structure. And when you started looking at some of the later images, if you go keep going, the kind of axonometrics of the building, let's say, right there, yeah, maybe go 2 back. Going forward doesn't matter, but so when you started kind of unpacking, right, maybe here is a kind of a diagrammatic input. When I'm starting looking at this, there seemed to be a strategy which deals almost with kind of a round plumb idea of an interiority that might carry that relationship between rectilinear structure related to the kind of encapsulated element outside. And then when you go back to your building, when the interior is developed, you go back to sort of more almost continuous floor plates. There are some cuts, right? Go back to the section, the final section. Yeah. Is this the final one?
Oh, yeah, this one here.
One of them. Okay. There seem to be, and I know this is just a half building. There is definitely the circular void here. Probably not this space, right? But it seems that kind of interior organization resolves into very sort of continuous floor plates, right? That idea that kind of a spatial organization that relates to both maybe how the puzzle produced a way of thinking about combining spaces or moving from one space to another relative to the capsule of outside sort of falls apart a little bit. And it's interesting because I think that there is as beautiful as this model is, and it's interesting as well as it's developed. I think there is this kind of a step in between, which if you could focus on it a little more, this idea how kind of chunks of buildings and chunk of spaces can create an interior where it's not defined by the sort of a Miesian the floor type where, you know, the floor is continuous, it's going all across the building, but there are maybe the spaces starts becoming thresholds by the sort of a round plumb spatial organization, but not necessarily determined by it. I think there is kind of another way of thinking about a puzzle as a spatial organization, which could be really interesting. And I think you maybe here it's a little bit more evident. You're doing it a little bit here with the planetarium and museum lobby, you're trying, but I think that is I think that geometry is coming from then negotiating the continuous floor logic with the capsule envelope, more than it's looking at how the structure of the puzzle of the kind of the interior puzzle that can hold the capsule can really produce the organization of the interior that it's much more ambiguous or much more related to the strategy of puzzle making. And but I was kind of really same thing. It was like the two sides of the projects are really super interesting, and they seem to kind of disconnect a little bit in the way how they're translated into each other. So. Tom, I think it's your turn to disagree. Oh, no, it's not a question.
I'm not disagreeing anything. Just the development of capsule is very interesting because all mechanical parts is happening in the center in a very complex way, and the others are totally solid. So on the way you translate that into the museum buildings, you should maintain, I really prefer you to maintain the the quality of a solid area and also mechanical area. But now it's translated into what Dana is saying, that it became like a slab buildings. So if you have a void, for example, how do you create that space in a solid area, which is you have to dig this solid, and then create some void area, which you can utilize the method of digging ground or digging solid pieces. So it's become much more interesting spatial areas. And then that's combined with mechanical centralized area. You can emphasize that, and then it will be a very interesting project.
Go back to the slide that I think Dana wanted, and go back to the single large building. Get it? No, forward again. You're right there.
This one?
No, keep going to the end, towards the site model.
Oh, this one.
Keep, no, it was in the site.
Oh, the site, sorry. I see.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right there. Go back. Yeah, right there. This guy. It's interesting. The difference in your work has to do with the questions you ask, right? It's not based on the observation of the formal. It's how you're the issues that are you see as relevant to any place in a project. And it's funny. I look at this and I ask just different questions, maybe, because I looked at your the capsule that forms your puzzle. It seemed as though that what's one of the things that's interesting about it is a very singular, simple form that is masking a complex spatial set of organizations, right? In terms of the pieces themselves, right? And you can choose to read that or not read that. And in this case, you've made it very overt that you've purposely allowed the interior, right, to be extroverted, to understand the reality of that. You could have kept the capsule and repressed it. There'd been a choice. One set of issues, meaning you're discussing the role of the idea now that had to do with the singularity of the skin, right? The controlling mechanism versus the complexity of the interior, or let's not even say complexity, the differentiation, the undifferentiated exterior to a differentiated interior. And then you look at this one, and now another set of, it's getting more complex, that you've made a decision that this form, either as a single object in a simplicity or the interior isn't enough to solve your problem. And you're now doing, let's say, two operations. One, there's another set of this, it seems like things that are similar to the interior, right? This coming out of it in this direction, vis-a-vis this guy. And there's a whole notion of how it touches the ground. And again, I would have just, Abdullah, I would have just asked certain questions at this point as you're shifting from one set of issues that made the puzzle, and then has to do with the formal operation of the puzzle, right? And you're now asking, how do those characteristics, how are they useful to me architecturally as I put them to much more complicated performances, and in this case, site performances, let's say, much less the functioning of the interiors. And what does this mean? Because again, I would have just asked, like this one, it just sits on the site in a very simple way, and you can make a case for that. And you start arguing that these things are just sitting on the site. And it seems like in your case, you have one set of things here that solve one problem. You have the objects, three of them, and all three are very different. One you just set on the edge, and kind of interesting edge because it does this, it does this. Oh, I lost my drawing. Yeah, it's doing this and it kind of sits out here somehow, right? And in this one, you have another piece that makes the edge and it's embedded in the piece. And in this one's the way complex one. I can't tell you because you built a new edge, the transition, the water coming through. Are you see? But it seems like at this point you needed to just make some very basic kind of attitudes of how this is going to be useful to you as part of a broad urban ensemble. Yeah. And it probably is going to be a little simpler as you make decisions, right? Of how these, and they're changing in scale, obviously, in a fairly major way, and how that is useful to you, because there's many, many more components, many more floors, whatever, as you do this one or this one or this one, which again would have been a part of your conversation.
Actually, if I want to just say one thing, going back to your point of why is it basically protruding outwards, I decided to make the interior a little bit poor outside the project for one simple reason. It was an either question of either creating this bunker and concealing things inside it, so the outside is not does not portray what the inside looks like, or basically opening up the project and allowing the pedestrians or the people on the outside to kind of sneak peek into what's really inside this project. So I decided to do the latter and open up the project and pour it into the site in another way. So that's where this idea came from. It was just basically a decision because of the monolithic qualities of the capsule itself, and whether I want to keep it as a solidified thick walls or opening it up and allow light and void to play part in it.
You did that here on this one, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, this one is not really so much developed. It's just basically a rough idea of what could be imagined in a future development, basically.
No, because here you decided your essential idea was quite a distance from solving the problem, because the stuff you added is quite aggressive and really reformulates the whole first notion you have of the object and the complexity of the elements that are interior to that or produce it, right? I mean, it's just a very, and same here, where you embed it in something. And the embedding now is a very literal notion to the site, right? Where this isn't, and this is yet something else. Again, I'd be taking some sort of an attitude of this, the relationship with this object. I think it'd been much simpler, actually, if you just accept it as a kind of a singular object. That's how it starts. If anything, this could have been, if you had some pieces out here, it'd be reversed, and this stuff right there is the one that connects to the things that are now free of the object. Another conversation.
I think this speculation is perhaps the least developed one, but you have earlier when the kind of a between the 3D puzzle and 2D puzzle, there's kind of a landscape strategy and there's an object making strategy, and I think that those two strategies could be actually quite successful. But I want to pick up on thing that Nanako said after I spoke about the kind of internal versus external organization. This issue of thickness is also super interesting, because it does suggest the thickness has ability within the puzzle itself to have the kind of a characteristics of the form to transition between your sort of the 3D round plum logic that I'm suggesting and the envelope itself, which could be useful as a kind of a mechanical strategy, as well as sort of a interior shaping strategy that transition starts to carry the characteristics of a different kind of a programmatic ideas and so on. So I think there's a little, in a way, your project is way simpler formally than some of the other ones, and that's its strength. The kind of a simplicity of the singular object that sort of is intricate inside, and the landscape itself has sort of, you're kind of taking the interiority of that structure and translating it into the landscape. So there's this kind of a, inside guts that are sort of spilled on outside landscape, and as aesthetically, to me, that makes a lot of sense. When you show the 3D axon of the whole site plan that Tom was just talking about, the rigor of those two relationships sort of falls apart. You're adding a lot of, you're kind of making a lot of design decisions sort of ad hoc. But I think that within that strategy, sort of an inside outside inside, there's quite a lot of potential. I would get rid of the continuous slab.
I think that, you know, the capsule he created had a center part is mechanical, which has a lot of joints and some mechanical parts which create rotations and stretches and things like that. And then when it comes to building, all the mechanical parts was lost. So I want you to go back to that mechanical part and develop, as you develop the center part, and then stick to the idea and then make it to work in a bigger scale. And that could have been very successful project in that way.
Thank you, Abdullah.
Thank you.
We have 2 more projects.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Hi guys. Hello. I'm Pasni and my partner here's Phoebe. So here's our project. We began our project by studying the assembly method of Miguel Baracal's Mini Maria sculpture. As we were unpacking the puzzle, we dive into the idea of part-to-whole assembly. The sculpture follows a specific sequence that requires the smaller parts to form a larger whole.
Besides the assembly method, we also studied the puzzle from its form. One thing that we found interesting is 1/3 proportion of how the puzzle split itself. And another one of the key moments, which is also one of the one drove the major of our project this semester, is the moment on the upper right hand corner of the puzzle, where it has this spherical element, although just as a decoration here, actually implies a continuation inside and connects to the other spherical element that's on the other side. Therefore, when moving to develop our own 3D puzzle, the idea of both the assembly method and the visual perception are taken forward to create 2 splines as the key elements that will eventually interlock the 1/3 and the 2/3 part of the puzzle together by 3-dimensional rotation. In the elevation of the puzzle, the false seams and carved outs manifest not only the interiority of the puzzle, but also the ambiguity that we found in Mini Maria.
Another visual miscue that we found in Minimaria, let me display here. Okay, another visual miscue that we found in Mini-Maria model was the roundness of the part edges, which we perceive as hinges. Our 2D puzzle is a series of tessellated tiles. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah. Our 2D puzzle is the series of tessellated tiles, which are connected from corners to corners to suggest a continuous field that it occupies. We imagine our 2D puzzle has layers of hidden mechanism similar to the Baracos piece. The disassembly requires the top pieces to be rotated out and overlap with their neighbors before being lifted up. Once the top layers are removed, the underlying pieces can slide out and the tiles can be disassembled at last. To reinforce the continuity between each tile, we use two-dimensional rotation movement of the pieces to introduce some surface treatment. We also bring this idea with us as we move towards the development of the project.
So moving forward to develop a detail that can be used in the actual building, we decide to transform the 2D puzzle into a motific detail that will refer as to keep its aesthetic and the form recognizable in an explicit way. The 2D puzzle then get developed into a facade system that remains the sense of the puzzle in another way, which gets assembled vertically. The rotational piece remain their mechanism here too, to form a facade that has more control of the lighting.
Moving toward the development of the building and the site, our initial idea is to use our 3D puzzle as the massing of our building and use the abstraction of the 2D puzzle as the site. We use our 3D puzzle to capture a sense of movement that ripples to the ground to create a crack that is also shown in Mini-Maria puzzle. We use the assembly of the ground pieces to draw focus on the moment where the ground touches one another and created a crack that ripples outwards beyond its boundary. By doing so, the ambiguity occurs as the parts obscure the process of the carve out.
When moving forward, we enter into a stage to develop back and forth between puzzles and building. The idea of puzzling is continued and transformed when designing the building to allow different puzzle pieces to work as separation of space and hint for designing the exterior. The form of the two spline not only got redesigned to better fit with the new space and programs, but also, just play one more time. But also, work as keys to interlock the rest of the building into the ground and behave as the center of the puzzle that unifies all parts from inside out, which negotiates the connection between circulation, building, and its surroundings. Looking at the entire side of Taylor Yard, ground and building are located on the south part of it that's closer to the only existing entrance, leaving the majority of the rest of the land for landscaping in the future, which is those area. Driveway and pathway are redesigned to cooperate with the new design ground and building from different places. Water as a small river are brought into our site not only as a result of the ground cracks, but also make the space more lively. Carving out on the side got designed into stairs and pathway for people to get closer to the building.
The translation from the puzzle to the building involves the development of relationship between the ground and the building further. Since our ground contains volumetric quality and a large scale, it becomes another occupiable space designated for galleries and theater. The nested splines of our 3D puzzle function as a tool that ties together not only the parts within the 3D puzzle, but also the puzzle in relation to its ground. The first spline represents itself through its absence. It ties together the circulation at ground level, taking the visitor from the entrance to the building and onto the other side of the site. The path functions as a public program that allows pedestrians to circulate through the building without having to enter the museum. The circumcirculatory elements contain both interior and exterior spaces within the building. Formally, it connects the underground gallery to the bridge at the center of the building. Functionally, it allows the visitor to segue from the entrance into the gallery and to move from one part of the building into another. It partially function as circulation as well as perceptual tool for people to experience the nested space. The third circulatory element is another piece that connects the program in the building to the program in the building's ground. It intersects with the other two paths and create a room for a theater underground. The notch is the result of these circulatory elements act as both an intertwined space that the visitors can segue into different paths, as well as a tool that ties together parts of the building. The cladding on the building derived from our assembly method, the panelization and material difference serves as a tool to both represent and rescue the building internal mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think this project is really a successful project. They invented simple, it's not simple, very complex, but the simple mechanism of joining these pieces. And then it's become very much like a mechanical. But that idea is applying into different scales and then really shows in the big buildings. And then they're utilizing that detail on the facade, but also the organization of the buildings, and then also site. And I really like how they thought about this project, and it's really successful, and I really like it.
Could you go back to the site plan, the site model, the object on the site?
This one?
There's it's in oblique, not a plan. Next one.
This one?
Yeah, this is fine. Was there one more above? Were these the two? Okay, this shows it. You made the from the very beginning. That's okay. Ooh, this is good. Whatever, this is good. What you seem to understand. That first place, I think it operates at a very abstract level, and it's in a proper place to where you are in the problem. But you immediately made a connection between the Mata Clark moment in your work as you cut it and the site, and then you put the cut to work and you make it part of the river, and it becomes the major kind of organizational strategy as a site plan. And there's a direct connectivity between the site, the augmented site, and the building, right? In a very, very kind of major way that's really working. The other thing I think that's happening that's a little different than the others, or alludes to it, is these elements which are clearly there's an arbitrariness as they become part of an architectural idea, because they come from puzzle making and they come from whatever is driving you to those particular forms. Although you seem to have you've left one, your puzzle, if I read it correctly, is incomplete. It has a void in it, and again, for me now, I would go back to kind of bigger ideas, because I would have said incompletion, openness is something that you're striving for. That's something that represents a continuity of who you are as an architect. And it's going to make you interested in people like Alberto Eco, and it's going to take you someplace. And if that's actually what's behind this, there's a broader kind of an idea. And but that incompleteness, both at the site level and the object on this site, is very, very powerful here, and it's working for you, and it's radically altering the site, because your strategy with the cutting the site with the water is very powerful, especially since it's not really a river; it's an empty It's a sewer drain. It's a concrete thing, right? The water is it's not a river, right? It's empty, and which would be a whole other discussion. But then when you go to the section, the model section, what it also brings up to me that we haven't touched on is that as you're moving through these shapes, and the sections kind of all erase them that we looked at. They made conventional sections. It becomes you have a complete different organizational idea, which is three-dimensional, and they have radically different shapes in terms of their horizontality and verticality, and their obliqueness, right? Their non-orthogonal Cartesian relationship, which form spaces that could be programmatic. Oh, they could also be violated, and you're aware that a single program goes through different spatial types. Do you know the Berlin Science Building in Berlin, Sterling, who use Kahn? Intentionally differentiated pieces that he layers, and he doesn't make them inspect. There's a one-to-one connection between functionality, but in fact glues them together. And those kind of arguments come up with this, whether in fact the shapes that give you really different kind of organizational structure are in fact departments or represent some sort of functionality in terms of the organization of the building, or whether they're violated. But you would have to have kind of a clear idea of that as you pursue this thing, right? In terms of what this means, because you've produced a very unique organization, which is the output of the puzzle making, right? There's a it's purposely not looking at parameters of function to form it, right? It's challenging kind of very straightforward kind of functional approaches to the project with these abstractions. And then as you look at could you go back and show some of the pieces inside this? And you're looking at radically different organizational types, which again would be the whole output of this approach, which makes it so unique that these are the things that are now becoming, at some point, they're driven by performance, or they're accommodating performance in terms of the various functionalities, right? And you can make maybe some very simple connections sometimes in terms of whether it's a theater or a classroom or whatever it is, but it's extremely interesting. I think it'd be, again, this would be a conversation with Dwayne. You, in a way, don't have to go to sections. It would be clear if you could just make these kind of a broader, you don't need to go that far yet. You're not ready. It seems like the project, show me the model again, one of the sectional models, that you could leave it, this is kind of vague. It doesn't have to be completed yet. You're not ready yet, right? Because it's very, very kind of clear, the big idea and how it's useful to you and what its possibilities are. But again, I'm looking at these shapes, and you'd have to, it'd be a huge, I guess you spent some time. Yeah, there's one of the things it does this, right? I had to go back to the puzzle again, but I'd look at the kind of, and then is this a kind of piece of the puzzle? They're all kind of incredibly kind of unique spatial organizational types. And then do they have their own movement? How do they connect together? And another thing I think this shows that we haven't talked about is that it's a scheme that, based on the puzzle, is radically interested in connectivity. It's about relational structure. This thing to this thing, this thing to this thing. And it makes it, again, a very broad idea that you're committed to an architecture of not isolated objects or a detachedness as an idea, but an architecture that's absolutely committed to connectivity and to relationship making, right? Would be the broader kind of notion. And you're very interested in the thing between these objects then, just like when you cut the thing across, which is a basic site move, right? And it's extremely kind of powerful as you do that. And you've given the river, instead of literally, you've used the river as a means to produce a very dynamic condition of the site, which makes it kind of also a very specific project, not transferable to any other site, right? Radically specific to this project and to your thinking of the specificity of this particular site. Be a very beautiful piece of work.
I'll just quickly add to that. I think it was very comprehensive. I have to take off in a minute, and I just want to say it's been really incredible work to look at. So you guys put so much effort into work. But with this specific project, it's the moment when the puzzle kind of starts, when you guys show the puzzle, the kind of the gap between the pieces, the creation of the gap there within the pieces, it was both really smart because you're creating the joint produces the void rather than it just produces the character of the parts. And it's that void that is really successful as a translation to the section, where it occurs not just as almost kind of the formal move between the two parts of the building that Tom was just pointing out, but if we go to the second section, it also occurs within the individual parts of the each parts of the building. And I find it to be super interesting where you know, it's not a slab building. It starts producing the voids through the logic of a puzzling on a multiple scales. So this issue of interscalability from kind of conceptual model to spatial model is really present with a project. And I think that's really successful. So thank you so much. And I'll just want to say goodbye. And it's really good to see you, Annika. Hello, Tom. And thanks, Dwayne. Thank everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Bethany. Tom and Nanako, are you both able to stay? Sorry, we've gone over. We just have one more.
Okay, no, I'm with you.
Okay, fantastic. Hernan's going to join us right at 12:30. What do you think? Should we have him begin or should we take a 3-minute break and let Hernan join us?
Whatever, I'm free.
Yeah, I've got a meeting right after this too, so let's keep going.
Okay. Okay, Faris and Jordan. Hernan's a smart guy. He'll catch up. He was also on the midterm, so he's familiar with the project. He was at the midterm, correct? Yes. We can't hear you, Faris.
Is this midterm?
No, 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 no.
I'm so impressed.
Hello.
Yeah, we heard you there.
Oh, cool. Hi, I'm Faris.
I'm Jordan.
Our initial interest in the Barricall work, Richelieu, began with examining the characteristics of the individual pieces of the statue rather than the work as a whole. Like the Barricall piece, we are interested in the contrast between the complexity of the monolithic whole versus the highly articulated individual parts. Individual pieces are composed of mostly simple aggregated platonic solids, and complexity is achieved through intricate interlocking joinery methods and actions, such as rotation and sliding. Similar to Japanese joinery, the initial seemingly misalignment of pieces is resolved by a series of rotations in which the correct sequencing becomes imperative, as each rotation allows for the insertion of new pieces and impedes others.
The 3D puzzle combines Barricall's formal characteristics of the articulate pieces and resulting monolithic form with the sequential method of rotation found in Japanese joinery. Pieces must be first orientated to form an apparent formal misalignment and rotated to allow for sequential pieces to be inserted. To ensure rotation is necessary, orientating the pieces directly to the apparent alignment blocks any further pieces from being inserted. Additionally, multiple axes and methods of rotation of two wood pieces are used to secure the puzzle together. Score marks are used to mark paths of rotation and movement of assembly. The slight misalignment from movement and score marks creates a tension between the motion and the markers of motion.
I would have a slightly different take because I've been ruminating on know housing of the project. It's highly determined by the technology of plumbing and so forth, part of the argument. I could see perhaps following on the last discussion.
In the 2D puzzle, pieces must first be placed, then rotated, enabling the following pieces to be inserted, like the lock pieces, which must first be slid, then rotated into the correct position. Other pieces similar to the 3D puzzle must first be inserted into a seemingly misaligned position, but then rotate into the correct orientation. For some reason, the GIF is rotation allows for another piece to be inserted, and this is repeated throughout the puzzle. Graphical patterns cut into the piece and to connect parts to the whole and establish an overall continuity. Additionally, the patterns establish indications of completion when rotating the pieces by serving as markers of alignment and motion.
The siding model uses the complete 3D puzzle as an architectural object that can be seen in the act of disassembly or assembly. This action creates voids or cracks that carve into the previously solid object and allows for more interstitial space between the parts. The rotation and placement of the whole objects puts it in a precarious posture as it touches the ground in a few points that helps break down the monolithic 3D puzzle in form and materiality. Furthermore, the landscape is created by an indexing of movements generated by the 3D puzzle, as it is assembled or disassembled. The movement cuts into and carves into the landscape to enable rotation, and past movement of the object is preserved as residual relief of other possible sightings and orientations.
On the site in Taylor Yard, the building, a natural history museum, uses similar strategies and formal properties found in the puzzles, like rotations and striations to embed itself into the landscape. The proposed site is bounded by sports fields, playgrounds, and the LA River, but currently lacks clear access to any surrounding amenities. The Natural History Museum and surrounding landscape extends into the existing park, and facilitates connections and movements between the park, future development sites, and the river, which was previously isolated and inaccessible due to the train tracks. Near the museum, the ground slopes down to create a plaza, outdoor theater, and extension of the park, while the landscape rises up to the ground of the building. Using graphic strategies found in the 2D puzzle, hardscapes cut into the landscape to create skylights, paths, planters, and large public gathering spaces that currently do not exist at Taylor Yard. Marks and cuts on the landscape suggest past rotation of the building pieces as they have been placed into the ground and are used to make connections and integrate between disparate pieces to a unified site. The entrance into the building happens along the public plaza edge, where the building cuts into the landscape and is accessible from the park. From the road, ramps connect a drop-off and pickup area.
Like the 3D puzzle, large chunks interlock with each other through a sequence of sliding and rotational movements. And as a whole, the building is rotated on the site in the same way the 3D puzzle must be to insert the final piece. The building can be seen as an act of disassembly as pieces begin to be pulled apart from each other, creating new public interstitial spaces between the chunks. These void spaces also function to establish internal circulation that follows the innate formal characteristics. Poche, a direct result of the rotation, produces challenging fragments of space, but becomes productive with vitrines and exhibition spaces embedded and interlocked within the whole. The tilted posture of the building also allows for connections and views into other galleries and exhibit spaces and makes it appropriate for viewing larger exhibits inherent to a natural history museum, such as displays of massive skeletons. The indexing of movements is marked by reliefs, cuts, and material changes, with scoring found on the 3D puzzle that used to become slots of fenestration in the building.
The main central stair acts as sorry. The main central stair acts as an additional piece that inserts as a piece into the building. Slight moves of rotation. Slight moves of rotation make the stair more dynamic as it interlocks into the floor plates and connects to adjacent exhibits. The guardrail presents itself as a series of pieces that rotate and lock with one another to establish the rise and run of the steps. And strategies of the main central stair were developed from this earlier version that focused on rotation and interlock of each individual tread. We were interested in how the rotation of parts influenced the shape of the stair. For example, in the treads, the nose is created from the rotation of a piece, which then allows another piece to be inserted. And that concludes our presentation. Thanks.
Yeah.
Could I've got to run. Could I make some comments first? Could Fairness, could you go back to your model that shows the site and the model sitting on the site? Yeah, that's good. Anyway, it's interesting because this kind of opens up another side for me of the conversation we've been having. And Dwayne, in this one, it's really interesting because from the very beginning, you showed your puzzle with different materiality. And that's what everybody's been doing. But this one just struck me. They were looking at these, whatever there were, 4 different materials, and they make up the quality of the piece, having to do with the differentiation of you've organized the puzzle pieces so they have some commonality in terms of their material, right? And their shapes are different, but there's a commonality of 4 different, I think it's 4, right? 4 different materials. And then here it is, it shows up still in your final project. And the last one we talked about was that the organizational types make a very particular now kind of, they organize architecturally your project, spatially, et cetera, for potential accommodation of uses, et cetera, that you're gonna now produce this is accommodating various functionalities. And then I looked at this one and I looked at your stair now, and it's the first time for me anyway, I connected micro. Wouldn't that mean that, and again, instead of the sections in many cases kind of violated, it seemed like they're really strong ideas here, that what's really important is one is off black, and one is gray and one is red. And in the red one, you have the stair you showed, the red stair. And in the other one, you have another stair. And each of them now takes on a characteristic of the puzzling, which is now spatial, right? And it's the whole kind of idea of the project, which is a total non sequitur. You produce something that has nothing to do with anything other than it has mass, and it produces some sort of a suborder having to do with the puzzle, the notion of how you invented the puzzle and how it fits together mechanically, right? And then all of a sudden you're saying this is going to become architecture. This is the idea I'm going to use to produce a very kind of large scale project that's a school on a very given site. But it seems like it does lead you to some super interesting ideas. And then the micro, to me, it's more interesting that the stair in this piece would be somehow differentiated, because that's what you're doing. You're producing a complete different kind of an organizational idea, where a stair isn't systemic anymore. It belongs to its environment. That's one of the 4 zones that you created because you've rewritten an organizational idea. It's my reading. Or again, in terms of maybe what we went to this morning, it seems like the project itself that starts with the puzzle, it does just ask questions finally, because it's a non sequitur connection between the puzzle and the building. It opens up questions about its relationship to organizing our work, right? And it produces a very different kind of thinking of how we produce the work and what those interconnections are. And to me, Dwayne, that's my reading of this thing. And I find it really fascinating that it gives me also a connection between macro, micro. And in terms of, where is this? Can I draw on this thing? Kind of how you operate. This one's a little less clear. Funny, you rotated it. I would have just left it. I find that's not at all kind of interesting. It's also kind of an old idea, and you don't have to do that to make this work. I would have left it orthogonal myself. Could you show the site one again? That I would have focused on the relationships you're producing is enough to do it, and you could have left the thing a cube. In fact, if anything, the cube is kind of referential to a past architecture. It's referential to the city. It's evidence. It's just a marker you've left, and it's not necessary because there's already so many things happening. I would have let that piece be, let this do this, and let these other things be the violation, because you're just making all kinds of. You're also making the projects all self-similar when you look at the section, because they're now all fragments of a triangle, and it seems that they're much more interesting when you really the thing you're looking at is this belongs to an order, and then that's another one, and again you start taking them apart, right? And that is your ordering system and the voids between them, like we discussed in the last project. And it seems just to me much more interesting. And then this gets a little simpler. It's nice you guys have the studio because you can look at each other's work and it's really useful. Because as I said, the last project, it's very useful to you that it made a kind of a gesture in the site, which you're kind of looking for still. And it seems a little bit chaotic. It's just not clear enough yet. You need maybe they had a kind of a singular gesture with the cut, right? And they cut the site and the building, and that was extremely useful, right? That was the beginning of a broad organizational idea between building and site. But it's really, really interesting. And then what carries through, you'll go back to your first model, this model abstract. Because the discussion is what does finally find its way through the process? Show us the end one. Yeah, this guy. Okay. What carries through in this idea to architecture, right? As a thesis, right? Because you're saying this is your organizational model. It's not mine. It's not most people. They're going to start from some other idea of what architecture is, right? And you're saying it's this. But here it is. These kind of pieces that interlock in a certain way that represent some usefulness to you to spatialize, program, right? To concretize the world in terms of the various activities that are in the school or not. And it's a very, very different notion, as well as when you take pieces out of it and make voids out of it, which is another kind of conversation we haven't had yet. And in yours, you absolutely can carry this through. You're doing it, right? And you're now deciding how this is useful to you. But for me, again, I've been more interested that the whole kind of the scalar thing within these follows some notion that the materiality does for you here. That there's an environment that takes place. This is all that stuff versus this, right? And it seems that alone to make it extreme. And it goes back to the earlier conversations we had in terms of Dwayne's interest in materiality and assembly. It would have given you some really interesting ideas. And you're in this thing and all the stairs are wood. And the whole thing is it's made out of a complete different, it's not type 1, it's top 5. Well, that's architecture, but it gives you a complete different sensibility, the nature of how you go about finishing this and dealing again from primary to secondary to tertiary structure, where that stair does have a direct link to an idea of how you define this piece versus this one versus this one. Does that make sense? My interpretation, anyway, whatever. Dwayne, a very, very interesting studio. I've got to run to my meeting now too, but
thank you so much.
Great. The class, very, very nice work, guys. Really amazing. Hugely disciplined, rigorous, and comprehensive, that allows us to have these kind of conversations. It's a pleasure.
Really appreciate you being here.
Nanico, take care. Haven't seen you for a while. I'm going to head back to New York soon. It's our first goal right now, to get back to New York.
Oh, great. Maybe we should meet somewhere.
Absolutely. We'll see each other soon. Turn on. Take care, buddy.
Good to see you, Tom.
You too. Talk soon.
Yep.
Take care, Dwayne.
You too.
Maybe to jump in, and sorry, I'm late to the party, so I'm probably mine is completely rusty comments because I haven't been part of the conversation. So I have to say, first and foremost, Jordan, how is Faris or Faris?
Faris.
Faris. It's an insanely cool project, so I congratulations on it. It makes me think about a lot of things in relation to what you're doing and the logic. I took a quick look at the mirror of all the other projects. I have to say, I think the premise is to me, the premise is fantastic, because I'm for once, I believe that the design and everything that we do as designer is the byproduct of obsessions. So I think that there is a level of obsession in the way the studio is set up, and in your project particularly, which I think is absolutely logical to follow. Which to me is almost like I asking my question, okay, what's next? What are the things? And there are 2 or 3 things that come to mind when the project starts to take shape, coming from the puzzle system. And one of the questions I have is, how much, and I think right now the goal, at least for the 2 of you, is that we can see the echo of the origin all the way in to the end of the project. And I think that has a lot of value and it has an importance and almost an indexical way to understand this notion of assembly. On the other hand, I start to ask myself, what happens if the codification of color or material will start to lose as we move forward? Like, do I need to read all the way what is the origin of each of the pieces? In other words, there is a moment where they think you can start cheating. You know, what happens if the pieces don't start to fit? What do I do? Do I start to add elements to make it fit or not? And again, this is not a criticism. This is more me thinking as a designer, okay, what I will take this, what it will be, and maybe it's my nature because I always like to make things that they don't completely fit. But there is something interesting about those moments. And I think some of the moments that I think maybe Tom was referring, to me start to become more interesting. What there are those moments in which the thing collapse, like the stairs, and you start to say, okay, I can start to see the color, the material codification coming in. Or what happened, how much I need to respect the order of the architectonic logic I'm going to have to start to imply because I need to have floor plates and spaces and so on. So I wonder again, if there are moments in which you will start to recognize, okay, what are the moments that I need or I want to move away from that completely relentless logic from beginning to an end. I'm pretty sure that there are moments of cheating that they are not evident for us, for the observers of the project. So I keep thinking about those things. At the same time, I think as an exercise of design is absolutely flawless in the idea that you start, and Tom was talking about the secretary, which I'm all for. I'm for one, I believe that any exercise of architecture is like that. I mean, even the one that pretend to people that start with things that they think to belong, I always think that it's a little bit of bullshit in it. I think at the end of the day, the logics of process are always this kind of a foreign mechanisms that we bring into it. And actually, I think is where those moments start. But I keep looking, what are the moments of accidents? Where are the moments of conflict? And that to me is where I think the potential for you guys to keep exploring as you move forward in your own trajectory, to start to think, okay, cheating maybe is the wrong word because it implies something but that is bad. But I'm talking cheating in a positive way, or bending the rules, or pushing the rules. So there is something really, really interesting in those moments. And I think the stairs became so important, I think, in how we read that, because the stair is the moment that revealed the conflict. It revealed with all these things collapse and collide into each other and need to be negotiated. But I think what you're doing with the stairs, I think it could be a logic that can be, it could be like a virus that keep contaminating the rest. So to me, as an appetite, I would say that would be what I would like to see the project moving forward. But overall, I think it's absolutely spectacular what you guys accomplished to put it together in terms of the logic of it. But I wonder, like, I don't know, when I was a kid, we were playing with Legos and so on. Legos at the time used to be much more egalitarian and simple. They were like rectangles or squares. There were not many options. You didn't have all the things that we have today with Star Wars or whatever else that the Lego are pre-formatted. So you need to create, and I remember cutting them and melting them to make it fit into other things that we wanted to do. So to me, that's what I think is super revealing about the stair systems, because again, it put these things in conflict. But I would encourage you to find what other moments of conflict this can produce. I'm less concerned about the fidelity of the placements of the volumes in relation to the puzzles. I like that. I like that you stick to the rules as much as you can. But I'm intrigued always when the rules are not enough. You know, where those moments happens. And I think the stairs, I would not say that you cheat, but the stairs start to show the possibility of that, because you have to start to do something else. So I'm really fascinated by that. And again, my apologies if the comments are completely off cuff, because I didn't have the chance to see how the whole conversation was shaping. But that's almost like my gut reaction and looking at this project.
Yeah, those are great comments. Both your comment and Tom's really have me thinking about something I've been thinking about a lot in the last month, that has to do with the use of the materiality in the models. And the idea that this is the second time I've taught this studio, and it's gotten more refined as we've gone forward. And I feel a little like the use of the materiality in the models. It's been very important in a sense that it suspends our decision-making process about real materiality while still adding a certain quality or characteristic to the work. But it also, there's also a limitation that's there through that. And I want to figure out how to get beyond that. I'm not sure I completely got all of Tom's comments, but one interpretation of it, or at least my interpretation of it, had to do with the idea that he was sort of okay with the indexing of it on some level, as though it might play out with this as a real material, and your associations are made through materiality. I don't think that is it. For me, that's not it. I've always used those associations as a way to suspend the belief that it's about material, but to understand, to recognize the associations because the material's there. I think it's more about a kind of tectonic sensibility for those things that we just haven't gotten to yet, but those tectonics are somehow entangled. It becomes far more interesting to me than just saying, oh, the red is associated with that red. I think there's a way to do that. You know, there's a limit to the way we get to it. So I got to think about how to reposition it.
I know, I can see, and I agree with that. So to me, it's less, and anybody who knows me a little bit, I'm one of the most removed away from materiality individuals in this field that you can find. I was talking about, you're absolutely right. On the other hand, I was thinking, if this was instead to be the model, this will be the building, I think also then it will take another dimension. Like if you build a building, like to try to make it look like a model, that will be an interesting issue too. So you know what I mean? Like I think some of the issue maybe is because it's still a model, but like if I don't know, like if you think about, I don't know, I was thinking somebody like Klaus Oldenburg, right? When he does a gigantic binocular, there's something about the literal about that that could be interesting. What I was talking, what I'm thinking more is about, and again, I don't think the indexicality per se is an issue. I'm just trying to think what it would mean if the fidelity of the code of again, whatever it is, material of the model of the render, whatever it is, but the notion of the codification of. So I wonder if that is an important thing or not. And Dwayne and Faris and Jordan, I'm not saying that that will be the answer. I wonder what it will be if we remove the code, that it will change the game or not, that it will change that we had to read it all the way or not. Because I will say there are two ways to think about that. One, if we force this project or these projects in the tradition of the process oriented and the result is a logical consequence of the process, it will be one read. The other one is if we read it as to say it's more like a game. So it's not so much about the fidelity of the process, but it's the idea of the literal, that we want to carry the literal this all the way to the end. And I think that to me are two different readings of the same logic. And I think that has to do maybe with intentionality. Like I also wonder, for example, what will happen when you introduce transparency on this? Does it need transparency or not? That will change that. And I don't know, this is an interesting conversation because, and this is a conversation that we only have because we are in the world of computer. Because before the world of computer, I don't know, if you look at model of let's say Ronchamp, it was made out of basswood. Nobody will think that the building was made out of basswood with something else. But today, because we again the notion of material and materiality is an interesting one. Are we're talking about materials into this becoming a building, or we're talking materials of this as a model, we're talking materials about the puzzle and all in between, or we're talking about just matter, or we're just talking about texturing and coloration. So for me, they're more like questions than anything else. I really don't have an answer for it. And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong one way or another. I wonder about this. I wonder how much it would change the perception of the project if that coherency start to mutate. And as I said, what happened when the things don't fit? You know what I mean? Because there are moments here that the pieces don't fit. So what happened between the things that they don't fit? And that's what I was pointing, that the stair seems like a good first glimpse about that moment, that they start to become almost this stitching between the pieces would not fit. But anyway, that's all it is.
Okay, for me, this is a very complex project, but also interesting way of developing this object. And then when it comes to landscape, it's essentially every pieces of this building or object is pre-planned, which is very interesting because usually you plan and then you don't pre-plan and then you start thinking about next stage. But this one is every component of this building is pre-planned. And then as you dropped each pieces on the landscape began to create its own ideas, which is very interesting. It means it's not really connecting to each other, but that's okay. You can connect these pieces later with the landscape. And that I like it very much. And then the interesting part of building is that you rotate this building in 45 angles, and then, but the inside was pre-planned so that you can get really different kind of organization inside interior of this object. I thought, and then when you look at very carefully, maybe each components are not really related to each other, but because of how you put these together, that it began to make sense, which I thought it's very interesting.
Well, thank you, Nanako. Thank you, Hernan. Really appreciate it. Any final comments from the students or Hernan and Nanako? All right, I just want to say, I'm going to say this privately, but I'm really, really proud of this group. Just amazingly thorough work. You know, the working on at all of these scales, the materiality, the physicality of it, it's really impressive. So amazing job.
Yeah, it's amazing work. It's really successful. Each student, each group produce a really different project, which is very interesting. I think everybody should be very proud.
Yeah, I will say very, very brief. I mean, as I said, I took a quick look at Miro, that all the project looks incredibly developed, incredibly precise. And I want to re-emphasize one more, how remarkable it is to do this under these circumstances. So it's really an extraordinary accomplishment for all of you. And you should take a lot of pride in that you managed to accomplish that. But also in vertical, second semester vertical, and for some of you, I always said this is very important for you to carry many of these ideas as you move into thesis. I think you walk away with a huge baggage of concept to keep developing. So I think this is, to me, there is a power of intelligence by making that the studios that Dwayne always produced, that I think is a remarkable treasure for you to keep as you move forward. So keep that in mind when you keep going. There is a conceptual and intellectual clarity that can by understanding these things. There is a reducible quality about that to me is at the essence of design, and I hope you never lose.
Great, Hannah, you should be very proud of having these people.
I am. We are proud of all of them.
Well, thank you all. I see Jenny's back. Thank you for dropping back in, Jenny. Why don't we, the students, why don't we take a 5-minute break and we'll meet back here. Actually, let's meet on the studio Zoom in 5 minutes. Okay? Okay, I'll see you there. Thank you.